As we mentioned, the North Korea nuclear threat, that's a major topic at the summit. We're joined now by Bruce Klinger in Washington. He's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former CIA deputy division chief for Korea. Bruce, thanks for joining us. You specialize in Korean affairs. What would be your advice to the G20 leaders for how to move forward in dealing with North Korea? I know that's not an easy question, but especially after this week's ICBM test.
Well, we need to emphasize to the G20 and particularly to Moscow and Beijing, who have been obstructionists, that the ICBM is yet another violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Whatever Russia wants to call it, it is an ICBM, and therefore it's now a direct threat to the United States. So the issue is becoming even more dangerous, more inflammatory. So we do need to press for additional measures against North Korea at the UN Security Council, but also Washington can use its own laws to increase pressure through targeted financial measures.
Of course, you can't talk about how to handle North Korea without talking about China. But the relationship between the U.S. and China has become a bit testy recently, though the president had what he felt was a pretty good meeting at Mar-a-Lago several months ago. Things seem to have changed a little. In fact, right before he left for the G20 summit, he tweeted out his disappointment in China. Trump has suggested that the U.S. could maybe impose trade sanctions on China, and he criticized them because he really felt they're not doing enough with North Korea. What can be done at this summit, though? We've heard that there's a possibility that Donald Trump may be meeting with the president of China.
President Trump went through the same learning curve with China as every other predecessor of his. Whether he believed at the Mar-a-Lago summit that China would do more, or whether he just felt he had to go through the motions, we don't know. But clearly China has overpromised and under-delivered, as they have done with every previous promise they've done on North Korea. I think before we try a large trade war with China, there are things we can do with our laws against Chinese banks and businesses that are engaging with North Korea.
Why isn't that being done? Bruce, I want to stay on that, because why isn't that being done? We hear over and over the responsibility is on China, which is, of course, North Korea's greatest patron financially. But what specifically are you talking about has the U.S. not done to leverage its economic and banking influence against North Korea?
We need to distinguish between diplomacy and law enforcement. The vast majority of all international financial transactions in the world, including China's and North Korea's, are denominated in dollars. That means they must go through U.S. Treasury Department regulated banks in the United States, either directly or through correspondent accounts. Therefore, we're not only allowed to, we're required to protect our financial system from those who are money laundering and other illicit activities. The U.S. has imposed $12 billion in fines on European banks for money laundering for Iran. We haven't imposed a single penny in sanctions on Chinese banks. Last week, we finally belatedly targeted a bank, the Bank of Dandong, as a money laundering concern. That's long overdue. There's long been even publicly available evidence that it was involved in that. I'm hoping that action is just the first shoe to drop against the Chinese banks and businesses that have been violating U.S. law.
So what is your take on it? Is it that China won't do more, or perhaps can't do more, doesn't have the influence that we're expecting the country to have? After all, it's not like we haven't imposed sanctions before on North Korea. It's not like they haven't been under a tremendous amount of pressure, but nothing really seems to change.
Well, it's a bit of both. China is very reluctant to increase pressure because they fear either an explosion in that North Korea would lash out or an implosion of regime instability or regime collapse. But the U.S. has been pulling our punches. We've done things to Iran and other nations that we haven't done to North Korea. So for whatever reason, U.S. presidents have been reluctant. The sanctions we've been doing on North Korea are what I call timid incrementalism. Sanctions officers in the United States government will say, we've got a long list of Chinese and North Korean violators we could sanction, but we only dole out a few entities to be sanctioned after each provocation. We should allow our law enforcement to go where the evidence takes us so that we sanction whoever's in violation of U.S. law.
I want to switch gears for a moment to the big meeting that we're expecting between President Putin and President Trump. What are you looking to come out of that meeting, Bruce?
Well, I think we're going to be disappointed. We would certainly hope that Russia would go along with the international consensus on the need to pressure North Korea for its repeated violations and repeated provocations. But as we've seen just in the last few days, which is consistent with previous Russian and Chinese behavior, they're obstructionists. They call really for a value-neutral policy of can't you two Koreas stop provoking each other when it's only North Korea that's doing the provoking and the violation. They call on a freeze for a freeze, that North Korea freeze its nuclear and missile tests, which are already required to do under UN resolutions, in return for the U.S. and South Korea really freezing or abandoning its military exercises, which we're allowed to do. So Russia continues to play the role of spoiler in Northeast Asia.
You know, Stephanie and I were talking about this meeting, and it's supposed to be about 40 minutes long. There'll be translators there. There's a lot of hype about this, but how much can really be done in such a short period of time?
For a summit meeting, a lot of the work has to be done before or after by senior working level or working level. The summits are often more to set the tone, to either reassure allies or to send a message to opponents. So the meeting itself is important for the vision, the image that it portrays, but any kind of real work would have to have been done ahead of time or afterwards. But Moscow has repeatedly shown that it really wants to be an obstruction to international pressure on North Korea.
All right, Bruce Klinger, thanks for your insights.
Oh, thank you for having me.